One of the cleverest and funniest songs from the Beatles' back catalogue is not actually a Lennon and McCartney composition. It's written by George Harrison. But it's a song that I believe George wrote about Lennon and McCartney. That track is Only a Northern Song, which George wrote for Sgt. Pepper, but was actually released a few years later on Yellow Submarine. The lyrics underwent a few changes before the song was released, in certain places losing some of their edge and passive aggression. But today I want to look at the lyrics taken mostly from an early version of the song which was released on the second Beatles anthology. This was, I believe, recorded in 1967 and is the closest, lyrically speaking, to how George originally wrote it. But before we dive into the lyrics, we need to understand the context in which they were written, so that we can interpret them in a reasonably informed way. So first, I want to look at the story of how George Harrison felt sidelined by Lennon and McCartney, Paul in particular, when it came to his songwriting contributions to the Beatles. Let's start in the era in which this song was written, 1967. According to The Express, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band has become the Beatles' best-selling album of all time, with more than 32 million copies sold worldwide. However, when the record was first brought to life, George Harrison was not a fan of how it was going. In fact, he couldn't stand what the band were making. A lot of the strain came from the fact that Harrison was never asked for his opinion during the songwriting process. Lennon and McCartney took over most of the songwriting sessions, leaving him feeling like he was being ignored. Harrison's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, later looked back on when the Beatles star quit the band in the middle of the recording session. Boyd said the Beatles made him unhappy with the constant arguments. They were vicious to each other. That was really upsetting. The star's ex-wife, who divorced Harrison in 1977, said that he was being sidelined by the rest of the band. Like a little brother, he was pushed into the background, she said. He would come home from recording and be full of anger. It was a very bad state that he was in. The Mirror develops this a little further, saying, George Harrison revealed Paul McCartney ruined him during his time in the Beatles. The late guitarist, who died in 2001 at the age of 58, shared he had no confidence in himself during an unearthed interview. He also shared that he and drummer Ringo Starr often felt overshadowed, as being in the Beatles became like the John and Paul show. George said, in a way, I always was like a bit of an observer of the Beatles, even though I was with them. Whereas I think John and Paul were the stars of the Beatles. As Paul and John Lennon's personalities came to the fore, it is claimed that George had to fight to get his songs heard on albums. The pair even started the official Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership to copyright their songs alone. George's close friend and musical confidant, Bob Dylan, publicly commented on what was really going on behind the scenes when he was in the band. The 81-year-old Blown in the Wind singer said previously, George got stuck with being the Beatle that had to fight to get songs on records because of Lennon and McCartney. Shedding light onto George's relationship with Paul, Pattie Boyd added, George saw Paul as difficult. They would tolerate each other, but I think George basically didn't like Paul's personality. I just think they really didn't love each other. And of course it is understandable that anyone would feel in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney as songwriters, especially considering they were writing songs like The One After 909 when they were barely out of their teens, or even still in their teens. George's first song on a Beatles record was Don't Bother Me on their second album with the Beatles. It's an okay song, but it was competing with the likes of From Me to You, She Loves You, and I Wanna Hold Your Hand, all of which were Lennon and McCartney penned smash hits at the time, and so, by contrast, it didn't really stand out. It seems that the tensions between George and the two main songwriters, McCartney in particular, didn't really come to the fore until the second half of their career, when George Harrison was really starting to flourish as a masterful songwriter. In an interview with Crawdaddy magazine in 1977, George said this about the White Album sessions. The problem was that John and Paul had written songs for so long it was difficult. First of all, because they had such a lot of tunes, and they automatically thought that theirs should be priority. So for me, I'd always have to wait through 10 of their songs before they'd even listen to one of mine. That was why All Things Must Pass had so many songs, because it was like I'd been constipated. I had a little encouragement from time to time, but it was very little, and it was like they were doing me a favour. I didn't have much confidence in writing songs because of that, because they never said, yeah, that's a good song. When we got into things like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, we recorded it one night and there was such a lack of enthusiasm, so I went home really disappointed because I knew the song was good. Ringo as well, we all gave as much as we could. The thing was, Paul and John wrote all the songs in the beginning, and they did write great songs, which made it more difficult to break in or get some action on the songwriting thing. As a northerner myself, there's a few interesting things I've noticed about northerners, just to make a few sweeping generalisations. The typical English stereotype that has persisted for centuries is based a little bit more on southern culture. And that stereotype is that the English are very polite, very nice to your face, but will actually take easy offence and go away and fester about it under the surface and possibly complain about it behind your back. The northern stereotype, however, has always been that, people from, say, Newcastle or Sheffield or Manchester are very, very, very forthright and will pretty much tell you what they think right to your face. People from Liverpool, however, in my opinion, are somewhat unique up north because, generally speaking, again, in my experience, they tend to be much less confrontational than the rest of us living up here. Of course, there's exceptions, there's no good, bad, right, wrong in that, it's just an impression that I've got. But what I personally view as that non-confrontational element in Liverpudlians was something that really struck me when watching the Beatles' Get Back documentary. You could see all the unspoken frustrations flying to and fro between the band members, but none more so than George Harrison and Paul McCartney. You could see all the way through that George wanted to say to Paul, "You're not the boss, you're not in charge, I want more of my songs on the album and stop telling me what to play or we're going to fall out." But all of it seemingly just goes mostly unsaid. They all seem to just sit there angry, kind of lashing out in little, maybe passive-aggressive ways. That unspoken tension between the band was really interesting to me because you could so visibly see all the frustrations and anger constantly bubbling just below the surface. In the end, predictably, in that documentary, George has a falling out with Paul, a very mild one, because Paul keeps asking him to play things that George doesn't want to. George announces that he's leaving the band and exits, but seemingly he never has a moment with Paul where he sits down and lays all his cards out on the table. In the end, he apparently shared his frustrations with John Lennon in private, who then related them to Paul in a secret meeting that was surreptitiously recorded by the filmmakers with a microphone hidden in a flower pot. In this conversation, John is appealing to Paul to stop trying to change George's songs and to stop telling him what to play. And in it, John puts his hand up and says that he has also been responsible for giving George the impression that he is inferior. Here is an abridged sample of that conversation. Paul asks, "So where's George?" John replies, "Well, he didn't want to be here. He just said he'll do it at home because of the compromises he has to make to be together. It's a festering wound, and yesterday we allowed it to go even deeper and we didn't give him any bandages. We both do it to George because you're afraid that how he'll play won't be like how you want him to play. And that's what we do. And that's what you do to me. My only regret about the past numbers, meaning songs, is that because I've been frightened, I've allowed you to take it somewhere I didn't want. If you give me your suggestions, let me reject them and pinch the ones I like. The same goes for the arrangements, because there was a period when none of us could actually say anything about your arrangements because you would reject it all. A lot of the times you were right, and a lot of the times you were wrong, same as we all are. You have always been the boss. I've been sort of secondary boss." But then Paul cuts in and says, "No, listen, really it is going to be much better if we can actually stick together and say, look George, on I've Got a Feeling, I want you to do it exactly like I play it, but then he'll say, I'm not you and I can't do it exactly like you do it. And you can see there from that conversation between John and Paul that there really is a problem, because both John and Paul are dead right. In any band, you can't refuse to play someone else's suggestion just because you feel it's not a true self-expression or whatever. That's just pretentious egotism. You have to serve the song, but also you have to get that balance right. You have to consider the input and the feelings of other members of the band and not just reject what they say because it doesn't automatically line up with the sound that you had in your head. And part of the problem here is that at this point the band didn't have a clear official leader in the absence of Brian Epstein. They don't have someone who is the chief. It's a really difficult one because when I watch that video I don't see Paul being a git, nor do I see George being a petulant child. I honestly see something a bit more complex, because whenever the Beatles rowed, there was pretty much always a valid case to be had on either side. The main thing I see in the breakdown of their relationships is the catastrophic loss of manager Brian Epstein, who previously was able to mediate these various relationships and keep the peace between the band. And sadly, the Beatles as a band never did overcome their differences in this really acrimonious phase right at the end. The band split up very messily and publicly, and Lennon and McCartney began sniping at one another in the press and through their music. And when John Lennon released his scathing song How Do You Sleep, slagging Paul off, George Harrison played lead guitar. It seems that George felt entirely justified in backing up John in attacking Paul. And it honestly seems to me that the relationship between George and Paul, even from interviews later in life, was permanently scarred by the constant sidelining of George's ideas while he was in the Beatles. Throughout the years, Paul McCartney has always been one for hand signals. While his face, generally speaking, remains impassive and his words always sound quite diplomatic, he quite often actually communicates what he's really thinking with his body language. And the footage on the screen right now is taken from a very famous YouTube clip which shows Paul subtly giving the middle finger to reporters who allegedly ask him questions he doesn't like. Some people who watch this will, I'm sure, go, "What a load of bollocks, you're reading too much into it." And maybe I am. But throughout my life it's always been the case, for me at least, that you can usually tell what someone really thinks via their body language. And here, in the Get Back documentary, we see Paul doing that exact same thing to George, subtly giving him the middle finger while they disagree about the direction of the song Get Back. And from this, I personally take it that the unspoken tension between them and Pattie Boyd's analysis of the whole situation, that they didn't really love each other at that time, was quite likely true. And so now we've set the scene to really understand how George was feeling in the second half of the Beatles' careers. So now let's look at the lyrics to Only a Northern Song in light of that context. Knowing just how frustrated George was, we can make a very small leap, an educated guess, at the inspiration behind these lyrics. In retrospect, George claimed that this song was written as a joke song, but I personally think that's a little bit of a deflection and a symptom of his more passive-aggressive character. It's easy to look at these lyrics and just write them off as nonsensical, psychedelic era bullshit. But my personal opinion is that this song is entirely about his contributions being sidelined by Lennon and McCartney and never given a fair hearing. Here's the first verse. If you're listening to this song, you may think the chords are going wrong, but they're not. I just wrote it like that. The chords are going wrong? Let's have a look at the chords. We start with 4 bars of A, 2 bars of a very mushy version of B minor on an organ, a bar and a half of E, and then 2 bars of D, with Ringo also putting a drum fill slap bang in the middle in a place it doesn't belong. It is a bit random, so it could be fair to say the chords are going wrong. But I also think there's a little more to it. I wonder if this was George in the lyrics of the song anticipating the criticisms that Paul and John were going to level against it. I wonder if it's even quoting past examples. When he says, if you're listening to this song, who is you? Who's he talking to? Is it addressed to the general public, the listener? I'm not sure, because the public loved him. When you see that he is anticipating criticism and attempting to defend himself against it, it seems most likely that he is addressing this song to the people Pattie Boyd described as his biggest critics, Lennon and McCartney. I think he is singing directly to them, anticipating their criticisms of the song he's singing right now, and responding to them within the body of the song. Let's look at the next verse. When you listen late at night, you may feel the words are not quite right, but they are. I just wrote them myself. And the words really are kind of off, because it's not a standard song, it's a song singing about itself. It constantly breaks the fourth wall in this strange circular way. It's the musical equivalent of going, this chord is an A, the next one is a B minor. I bet you bloody hate this song. And again in this second verse, just like the first verse, we have George anticipating the criticisms that will be made of this song in the body of the lyrics themselves. And here he says that the words aren't wrong. The problem is that I wrote them. You guys aren't writing the songs off because they're badly written, you're sidelining them simply because I wrote them. And now let's go on to the chorus, which seems to show the level of bitterness that George had already reached by 1967. It doesn't really matter what chords I play, what words I say, or time of day it is, as it's only a northern song. And by now you've probably picked up the theme that pretty much whatever he's singing is also happening in the song at the same time. In the first verse he talks about how the chords are going wrong, and as he's saying that line, George himself is on the organ mashing this crazy version of a B minor chord with loads of added notes that doesn't sound quite right. And here in the first chorus, as if to underscore the point of it doesn't really matter what chords I play, he bounces around pirouetting through multiple key changes with the chords as if to hammer the point home. And ironically, the chord sequence is absolutely brilliant. So for the chorus he goes E, B minor, G, C sharp 7, F sharp 7, got another B minor, another F sharp, and then D, A, D. It doesn't really matter what chords I play, what words I say, or time of day it is, when it's only a northern song. The first two chords, E and B minor, are diatonic, they're in that key. Then we go to a G, which is in a different key. Then we go to a C sharp 7. Listen to those two chords next to each other, G and a C sharp 7. That's called the tritone, or the devil's interval. It's one of the most discordant, jarring chord changes in music. And there, kind of showing off his chord ability, George uses it in a way that completely tricks the ears and you don't even notice. And so, within the lyrics of the song itself, he says, it doesn't really matter what these lyrics say. There you can see that strange, circular nature of this song. The chords make no difference, the lyrics make no difference, and time doesn't seem to make any difference either. One day is pretty much the same as the next. He then says, as it's only a northern song. So what does he mean by that? Northern Songs was the name of the song publishing company set up in 1963 to manage the songs written by Lennon and McCartney. George said this to Billboard in 1999 about this song. I realised Dick James had conned me out of the copyrights for my own songs by offering to become my publisher. As an 18 or 19-year-old kid, I thought, great, somebody's going to publish my songs. But he never said, and incidentally, when you sign this document here, you're assigning me the ownership of the songs, which is what it is. It was just a blatant theft. By the time I realised what had happened, When they were going public and making all this money out of this catalogue, I wrote Only a Northern Song as what we call a piss take, just to have a joke about it. Here's what Wikipedia says about that sale of the Northern Songs catalogue in 1965. During 1965, to reduce the income tax burden, it was decided to make Northern Songs a public company. 1,250,000 shares were traded on the London Stock Exchange. After the offer closed, Lennon and McCartney owned 15% each, James and Silver, who served as Northern Songs chairman, controlling 37.5%, with Harrison and Starr sharing 1.6%. So presumably then, George Harrison owned 0.8% of the song catalogue in which his songs were then being published. And in the song, I think he's just using wordplay to say, my songs are Northern Songs too, my songs are Beatles songs as well, and yet they keep being rejected. Perhaps just as the song Taxman was a complaint about unfair financial treatment by the British government of the time, this could also be seen as a complaint of unfair financial treatment in the world of music publishing. The theme of I am an equal Beatle but not being treated like one continues into the next chorus. It doesn't really matter what clothes I wear or how I fare or if my hair is brown when it's only a Northern song. George dressed like a Beatle, behaved like a Beatle and looked like a Beatle. But here he seems to be saying all these things still haven't added up to me being treated equally. He said the chords make no difference, the lyrics make no difference, time makes no difference, how I dress, how I behave, and what I look like make no difference whatsoever. My songs will be rejected. And perhaps by referencing Northern Songs, he's pointing out that those who publish the most songs in that era were the ones who earned the most money. The last verse of the song, however, is the most interesting one to me, and for this version I'm going to switch back from the Anthology 2 version to the actual final version of the song that was published on Yellow Submarine. If you think the harmony is a little dark and out of key, you're correct. There's nobody there. And I told you there's no one there. This verse is probably the most bitter and ironic one in the entire song. In the first two verses we have what might be criticisms of his songs from the past. You know, the chords are going wrong, the words are not quite right. If they are quotations, those might have been valid criticisms, who knows. But here is the third criticism. The harmony is a little dark and out of key. And he says, yes, you're correct, as if he's backing down and accepting that criticism when he knows, in fact, there isn't even a harmony part being sung. And of course, once again, this isn't represented just by the lyrics, but also in the song itself. There is no harmony being sung at the time either. And I can't help but wonder if this is a quite bitter, self-aware line from George, where he recognises that people are making criticisms of his songs based on completely inaccurate facts, and he is just going, yes, okay, you're right, and backing down when he shouldn't. How can a harmony be dark and out of key when there actually isn't even one there in the first place? Line by line, this song anticipates what the other Beatles are probably going to say about it, in George's opinion, simply because it was him who wrote it. And here's the hilarious part, the other Beatles seem to have missed the irony. Because the song was, of course, rejected by the other Beatles and not included on Sgt. Pepper's, the era in which it was written for. And so here we have a George Harrison concept song not only singing about itself in this strange circular way, but also accurately predicting the future. The song actually only got finished because they needed a few tracks to fill up space on the Yellow Submarine album, so they trawled through their outtakes and rejected songs, and Only a Northern Song was finished and released as a Beatles track. So George, in the lyrics to the actual song itself, accurately predicted how Lennon and McCartney would react to it, and he accurately predicted that the song would get vetoed. But that's not the only level of irony that the rest of the band seem to have missed. I believe the song was written and the backing tracks recorded in 1967. When it was finally dredged up to fill a gap in the Yellow Submarine album, more time had passed. And as we saw on the Get Back documentary, George had become deeply wounded. So I find it particularly interesting that the version on the anthology is quite clean and quite sparse. I know they flew in a few tracks to pad it out for the anthology, but nonetheless, it's not the cacophony that it afterwards became. Because when they returned to it, George allowed the song to scale new heights of irony, as all the way through he has both Lennon and McCartney creating an ungodly racket over the top of his song pretty much from start to finish. When you listen to it in that light, it sounds as if George has got them doing things that actively sabotage the entire song. Lennon on glockenspiel and McCartney on trumpet. It's also worth pointing out that Sgt. Pepper's was a concept album initially designed to tell the story of a fictional band. And to me at least, it seems that George attempted to take things one step further by writing and putting forward a concept song, one that told the story of his role in a very real band, the Beatles. I've always thought there was a hell of a lot more to George than met the eye, or than he would ever openly talk about. He was easily as creative and clever as Lennon and McCartney, but of all the Beatles, I think he was perhaps the most likely one to express himself in this way. And even though what he suffered through is genuinely quite sad, it did lead him to produce this insane, genre-busting tune that works on so many levels and seems to openly lampoon Lennon and McCartney, seemingly without them ever realising that they were blindly participating in a song that was actually both mocking and criticising them as they played it. Now I have to add, don't get me wrong here, I'm not standing in judgment on this. I wasn't there, I wasn't even born, and I'm sure there was far more to the situation than what we see here. I'm not Team George, and I'm not Team Paul. I just see this as a fascinating diary entry from George Harrison that sums up brilliantly how he was feeling and where his head was at that time. Even though it tends to fly under the radar a little bit in the Beatles canon, Only a Northern Song, to me at least, remains an outstanding piece of musical genius that works on so many levels that other songs just can't touch. And there's no denying it, even if he was a latecomer to songwriting compared to Lennon and McCartney, George Harrison was an absolute songwriting legend.